This podcast is brought to you by Knowledge at Wharton.
I'm Angie Bastiani. I'm here today with Rebecca Schaumberg. She's a professor in our Department of Operations, Information, and Decisions. Rebecca's research focuses on interpersonal communication, negotiations, mood, emotions, the soft skills that we bring to the office that really make a difference. Today, we're going to talk about her new co-authored paper. It's on the skill of listening. Becky, it's great to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Thank you.
So I found this paper to be really unique. The main finding is that when people talk to each other, when the listener agrees with the speaker thinks of that listener as a good listener. And conversely, when the listener disagrees, they think of that listener as a bad listener. Can you take us into the details?
Yeah, so you're right. At the heart of this work is that we really have this conflation between listening and agreement. I think we can intellectually say that, of course, someone could listen to me, they could attend really closely and disagree with me. I think intellectually we understand that listening and agreement are separate things. Right. But emotionally and viscerally, something is quite different. Our feelings of being listened to appear to be very closely tied to whether the person ultimately agrees or disagrees with us. And in this work, we ran 11 different experiments where people talked and exchanged information around a variety of different topics and across different mediums, such as online chats or video chats, or even through recorded messages. And what we found is that even when people listened exactly the same, so the experience was exactly the same, later, when you learned that that listener ultimately agreed with you, you thought that they had listened really well. And when they disagreed, you thought that they had listened poorly, even when you had objective cues otherwise.
What made you want to study this particular aspect of interpersonal communication?
Listening has been sort of elevated as a key aspect or trait of good leaders, as essential in workplaces, and actually as an essential tool for helping to bridge differences. But one of the things that we started to find in our research was that one of the key predictors about whether somebody actually felt heard was just whether that person agreed with them. But that seems somewhat problematic because ultimately when we want to think about listening is meant to be about information exchange, particularly in the workplace. And I know listening can be very different in like an interpersonal context, but in the workplace, listening is really a tool for information exchange. It's not necessarily supposed to just be about affirmation. But what our work shows is what it means to actually listen well, and then what it means to be perceived as a good listener might not necessarily be the same thing. Because one of the best ways to be perceived as a good listener is simply to agree. And that seems somewhat problematic when ultimately what we want to do with listening is help to exchange differing views.
Right. I noticed in your paper, one of the phrases that you come back to is, you're not listening to me, which, anyone who's had a conversation with someone else has felt that way at a certain time period. Let's go back to, you mentioned the experiments that you ran. You ran a number of experiments.
Yes.
I'm imagining like throwing a bunch of people in a room and having them have conversations about difficult topics. But tell us how you studied this, how you proved this theory.
Yeah, so we ran 11 different experiments with over 3,000 participants, and we used a variety of different methods, such as having conversations like this, so sort of synchronous chats online or written chats, or people recorded messages that somebody ultimately then listened to. And we had people talk about a variety of different topics. Here at Wharton, some of the students talked about campus-related issues. We had people talk about socio-political topics, or we had them talk about what were sort of simulated workplace issues, such as like who you might want to hire. And in every experiment, what we did is we held constant the actual listening. And this was because unbeknownst to our participants, all of our listeners or experiments were hired by us. They were like trained actors who we trained to listen in a particular way. And that the reason for that is we wanted to say like always the actual listening experience was the same. But after this listening experience, we gave information to participants about the views of the listener, whether they agreed with the listener's position, disagreed, or we didn't share that information at all. And what we found was that when we provided that information, people thought that the listener who agreed with them was a great listener. Those who disagreed with them were a pretty poor listener. And then though somewhere in the middle was when we perceived no information at all. And this occurred even when people had very strong cues that the person deeply understood what they were talking about.
I noticed that in the paper, when you walk us through these experiments, you do mention that you trained the listeners to do things like nod and say yes and give affirmations, verbal cues, nonverbal cues that they are agreeing with the listener. And then at the end, when that information was filled out, it didn't matter. It was consistent across the board through all your experiments that if the listener disagreed, that they were considered a bad listener, which I just find really fascinating. Is there a fairness issue there? I mean, as you mentioned earlier on, intellectually we know that there's a difference, but viscerally, emotionally, we don't. Is there something that we can do to make this perceived differently?
Well, I can first say, like, we did a lot, and we did a lot of work to figure out how we could maybe turn this off. And it was actually in that effort where the strength of the effect became so striking to me. So there was a couple experiments where we actually thought, let's manipulate how well somebody actually listened. So we trained our listeners to either listen really well or to listen poorly, like distracted by their phones, showing no level of comprehension. And what we thought is, well, then when you get a really strong cue that somebody has really understood you, that maybe should override this effect. But what we even found there, and again, this is where we're trying to take away the effect. We found that a bad listener, someone who was like distracted by their phone, looking around, not showing any level of understanding, when they agreed, they were still seen as a better listener than a person who listened very intently, could comprehend and share back every information that the speaker had said, but ultimately disagreed with them. So we found that a bad listener who agreed was seen as a better listener than a very good listener who disagreed. And there, when you come back to this question of fairness, I think that really puts it in stark relief that even when I am doing objective, I understand, I am taking in the information better. I understand, but ultimately just knowing your views does not mean that I should have to agree with them, because I can take that views, integrate it with other information I have, and ultimately come to a different conclusion. That doesn't mean that I did not listen well, but at least in terms of our experience, it sure feels like that.
It really does say something about our internal biases, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the main message from this research? Like if you were teaching about this paper in your classes on negotiation and et cetera, what is the main message here, especially in the office?
Well, it's interesting because I actually have started to teach this in my negotiations classes. And because what I want to say is that we can't necessarily use someone's views, whether they share our views or not share our views, as an indication that they really understand our position. And to understand that these things are very separate. And a theme that we keep coming back to in the paper, which you already alluded to, is that oftentimes when people say that, you're not listening to me, what they're really saying is you're not agreeing with me. And one of the things that I really want people to understand is that when you feel that way, right, that somebody is not listening to you, is it that they don't understand you, or is it that they ultimately are coming to a different position? So is this an issue of listening, or is this an issue of shared views? And now we see that these things are very hard to separate, but it's absolutely critical to find a way to separate them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all that insight. The paper is called Disagreement Gets Mistaken for Bad Listening. Becky Schaumberg. We have that link up for you online for that paper if you're interested in downloading it. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
For more insight from Knowledge at Wharton, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.